Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Legatum Institute. My name is Graham Leach. I'm Director of Economics here, and welcome to our first, actually, Economics of Prosperity lecture, or should I say lectures, because both Roger and I will be talking this evening on, well, I'll be talking first about what do we know about the economics of the EU, and then Roger will be talking about what's wrong with the EU, and putting forward a gentle plug for his new book, The Trouble with Europe. Then we're going to just break, and then we'll have a Q&A session, which hopefully will be a vigorous debate. Hopefully there are all sides of the debate represented here this evening, and no doubt I'll find out within the next hour. But what we really wanted to do was open up the debate, slightly different angles. Yes, looking at the UK position, clearly in the wake of events over the weekend, then that's a very hot topic at the moment. You'll notice that we're very impartial. We didn't want to sway the vote, so we moved the event till afterwards. But more seriously, we also wanted to look, and this is where Roger has done a massive job by bringing all the arguments together in the way that only he can, really. He does it in an amazing way. He's an international best-selling author. Most of the people in this room will be very, very familiar with him. And he's a colleague of mine on the SNPC, but I always feel the junior to somebody with so much experience. But it's going to be really good because we're going to get really to the heart of the UK angle and really to the heart of the future of Europe. And one of the quotes in the book, which I think really sums it all up from Roger's point of view, is that what lies between the EU is what lies between Europe and prosperity, which I think is will no doubt challenge some. And also, we've really recognised that for many, this is beyond an economic issue. Many people will make their judgment about the EU and the nature of the UK's relationship completely devoid of economic import. It will be basically a sovereign issue. For many as well, it's something of more of a belief. It's an aspirational, it's an ideal of bringing countries together. So we fully recognise that the economics is one element of this debate, and for many it won't be the controlling element. But for many, for the media, for business, this will be the defining element, and that's what I want to look at now. So what do we know about the economics of the EU? Well, I think we need to apply Donald Rumsfeld at such moments. You need Rummy's rules. Well, the first two, not the third one. What don't we know? We don't know. We'll leave that one aside. That's a little taxing. But the first one, what do we know about the economics of the EU? And what do we know we don't know about the economics of the EU? And that's what I really want to talk about tonight, because I want to actually say that in general terms, we know quite a lot, but in precise terms, and certainly in order to draw what you might call precise conclusions, one needs to know an awful lot more than we do now. And that's coming from somebody who many of you know is pretty hard on one side of the line. But nevertheless, I have to honestly acknowledge that it's a more nuanced issue than we maybe recognise at the present time. So we can draw some broad conclusions. But looking back, have there been times when we've been absolutely clear about what the position was in terms of the economics of the UK's relationship with the EU? Well, actually there was, right back at the beginning. Because in 1970, prior to accession, prior to joining the then common market, there were 5 major studies, 2 government white papers and 3 academic studies. And all of them are actually net negative in terms of, so the government actually went to the country at the time asking us to join the EU on the basis that political factors completely outweighed the economic costs. Now, that's a respectable intellectual argument. You could say they could be absolutely fundamental. It could be something about national self-interest that actually swamped economic interests. But we do have to recognise that way back in the beginning, when, of course, the whole concept of membership was narrower as well, when much of the negative cost involved was from the CAP and higher prices, and from direct transfer payments to Brussels. So it was a pretty simple decision back in those days. You could see the difference between world prices and food prices in the UK. You could work that out. You could see the cost on the consumer, and you could work out the transfer payments which went from London to Brussels. So back then, it wasn't exactly a surprise either that it was a negative number. But it is interesting, and we do actually forget often that right from the outset, this was deemed to be a negative economic relationship and not a positive one. And then there was a bit of a gap. There was single market analysis during the 80s on the impact of the single market, but there wasn't really any attempt at a full-scale cost-benefit analysis. Then in the mid-90s, the IEA, Hindley and Howe, came up with one study, and they updated it later as well. But the conclusions of that study were actually that the economic impact was rather small. It wasn't large. There were some movements around, pluses and minuses, but the net effect wasn't that great. And then a little bit later, around the turn of the century, it began to change. More studies came online, well, not online quite then, but more studies were published, which edged the numbers up a bit. I published one for the IOD, which said the net cost-benefit ratio was negative by around 1.75% of GDP. But again, I have to acknowledge there were lots of uncertainties, both up and down at the time. Subsequent to that, think tank Civitas published a study suggesting 4% of GDP was the net cost. Now, I have to say, in all these instances, there were challenges from people on the other side. People were saying, no, the number's less than that. You haven't accounted for this right. And that's part of the problem. There are a lot of uncertainties out there. But there was a general upward trend in the cost of membership in these studies. Interesting as well, there wasn't really any counterattack at all during this period. And indeed, right up to the present day, there have been limited counterattacks. But there was this upward trend. And then in 2005, the terms of the debate shifted slightly as well. Because at that time, Patrick Minford published a study which basically argued that the misallocation of resources because of the differential between EU and world prices in many goods was much greater than people were estimating. It was based on an American study in 2003. And it essentially argued that people were looking at WTO, most favoured nation tariffs, and saying that was what really determined the differential in prices. But actually, he actually showed that in many instances, those numbers were underestimating the price differential. In other words, the welfare economic costs of membership were substantially greater because world prices weren't prevailing as a result of the customs union and other aspects. So that shifted the terms of the debate, but it also sort of ground to a halt at the same time because there's limited data. A lot of this relates to anti-dumping duties and elements of non-tariff barriers as well, which are difficult to get a hold of and difficult to quantify. So there was a first attempt at it, but actually hasn't been a lot of progress subsequently. Minford also slightly blurred his argument because he introduced a kind of sort of forward-looking factor as well. So he talked about future harmonisation of the EU social model, which may or may not happen within the UK, but that was a significant element as well. On top of that, he talked about things like unfunded pension liabilities and how if the UK had to take a share of those. Now, neither of those assumptions may come to pass in my view. Actually, I think he was on stronger ground with the first one about price differentials. But nonetheless, he put them in and he got a thumping range of the net cost of the UK economy of EU membership of between 3% of GDP and 28% of GDP. So economists are nothing if not precise. So that was closely thereafter. There was a contribution from Gordon Brown. It was a sort of final epistle from the Treasury, and it was essentially along the lines that he wanted to show the growth potential of the EU to raise employment. And then so it was EU focused. It wasn't UK focused, but he looked at things like lack of competition. He did a sort of comparison with if the EU was like the US, which of course is not and then came up with a pan-EU figure, or the Treasury did, of about 28% of GDP cost as well. But it wasn't the cost of membership for the UK, it was for the EU, and it wasn't even the cost of membership for the EU either. It was certain specific aspects. And some of them certainly wouldn't apply in the UK to the same extent they did in the rest of the EU. So you've got this very big number after another very big number, and it really confirmed a trend, I think, which was that we can get away with much bigger numbers than we have hitherto. And I have to say that while I'm a skeptic, numbers in the high or the low double digits of GDP have got to be probably on the top side, to say the least. So clearly these numbers aren't meant to be definitive. We can't be precise there. So general orders of magnitude were increasing. Argument is that once they got into double digit, they were becoming a bit more questionable, but it was seen in others. Civitas updated their own 4% of GDP cost figures in 2004 to a 4 to 10% range in 2011. And then subsequently, Tim Congdon, writing the economic cost benefit analysis for UKIP, has actually come up with a sort of consistent 10, 11% of GDP figure. Although if you have it on a comparative basis to many of the other studies, it is actually probably slightly below 10%. But equally, there are lots of things which don't get included. You know, you could justify fraud and waste. You know, you could massive wastage in the common fisheries policy, massive wastage and fraud in other areas. But actually, most people don't tend to quantify those. They kind of, that's just a problem, we'll leave them in there. So the negative studies increased in size. I would say there were probably two counter studies which had the most weight. One was a study by Barry Eichengreen in 2008, which was EU focused, not UK focused, but said the EU level of output, again, not the percentage of GDP in annual terms, but it said that from the beginning to that period, the impact of EU membership had raised the EU level of output by around 5%, implying over that period, you know, a net positive annual effect, albeit not very big, given compounding over that period. Then 2012, the CBI published a report, and a number of you may remember it, where it said because it got all the attention was focused on their sort of 5% of GDP figure. Now, I have to say, the half of that roughly is based on single market analysis. The other, and it excludes a number of costs, direct costs to Brussels as well. So it's not comprehensive. But there's a slightly alarming jump as well, which got most of the critique at the time, where it jumps from around 2.5%, 3% to 5%, the benefits of GDP, the benefit to UK membership, with no justification whatsoever. It has a sentence, it seems reasonably to assume that the total would be around 5%. Well, the only number which got near that was the Eichengreen study, and it wasn't 5% of GDP per annum as effect in the cost measure. It was the level of GDP that was alluding to as well. And it wasn't alluding to the UK, it was to the EU. So even on the pro numbers, some of these studies, you know, don't exactly support some of the arguments they claim to do. So we've seen that most studies are negative, but not all. We've seen also that there's been an increase in the polarity of those. The numbers have got bigger both ways. Much more work needs to be done. Much more work needs to be done quantifying the impact of regulation. Absolutely fundamental, but so difficult to do. You can get broad figures, but is it stock? Is it flow? Is it really EU measures? Has that cost-benefit analysis got both costs and benefits, or is it all costs? What's the rigour with which the benefits have been worked out, and indeed the costs? Big questions there. And anybody who knows anything about regulatory impact assessments knows that this is not exactly a problem that's going to go away anytime soon. And then which ones do you aggregate? You know, the Acquis Communautaire is 125,000 pages. Exactly which ones are we going to target there? We can target agency working directives or working time directives, and they give very big numbers. And there aren't, every single piece of legislation isn't like that, But if there's 10,000 tiddlers, that could still aggregate to a rather large number. And many of you in different sectors will have experience in different ways and with different, obviously if you're not in the chemicals industry, the chemicals directive is not the number one thing which keeps you up at night, but it might be. And so that sort of sectoral analysis maybe is one way forward, but we need to have more details there. And on the resource misallocations, Patrick Midford's work there on the true world price and what that means in terms of welfare losses in the UK, that is fundamental. So lots of work to do there. But if we did that perfectly, and then the next morning we woke up and there'd been a referendum vote and the UK was now Brexit, that previous analysis would still be redundant, because the net cost benefit analysis ultimately depends on what the UK does the morning after and what the EU does. If rational men and women are negotiating the next morning, given our trade deficit, they'll say open markets, free trade access, no problem. If they're then we might face a different set of negotiators on the other side of the table. And what does the UK do? I am presuming here that the UK doesn't abandon all employment law in this scenario, but it could equally enforce all EU and just introduce it themselves, theoretically. Again, rationally, that would not be a very sensible thing to do. And in the political climate in the wake of any Brexit, that would be unlikely to happen. But it does remain a fact that it could happen. Or we could actually regulate ourselves so the net gain would be more limited. We don't know. Again, one of the key factors here is what does the UK do? And if you're going to the EU case, the case for exit in economic terms, obviously is substantiated by a simple move that the UK adopts more supply side and deregulatory behaviour and stimulates the supply side of the economy in order to maximise its comparative advantage in the new world it will face. So we've got real methodological issues here. A few of the studies overlap. The coverage doesn't always, is somewhat limited at times. We've got these whole issues around stock versus flow effects. We simply don't know in many areas what the real economic cost is of things like the social model. And so, where does that leave us? Well, quite simply, there's still a general conclusion which can be drawn. And that is, if you look at all the areas, direct costs and resource misallocations, these are ratcheting up the red numbers, the negatives. You have to have a big single market effect and a big FDI effect to make the case that exit would damage the UK economy in economic terms. Now, you could have that argument, but without that argument, then you can't, because all the negatives are quite clear. The uncertainty is over the magnitude of things like regulation, just how big is the impact. But you have to have a big single market effect. And that's where it gets difficult, because if you look at the macro research, there's really no discernible impact of the single market on the macro economy. And if you're going to say the UK is going to be damaged by FDI, you've got to deal with arguments, which is perfectly plausible that it could do. We see Japanese car makers interviewed in the Sunday Times, and there is a Japanese car, or there is a car manufacturer element to this, with the tariff level around 10%. That could be the car industry is one of those areas that you have to address that issue. But the UK is still number one for FDI in Europe in the latest surveys last week. So given the purported threat over the horizon, it doesn't seem to be alarming foreign investors yet anyway. And also, you have to remember that the single market effect is limited, ultimately to around 10% of the UK economy. 80% is domestic, 20% global split, and 10% about EU. And that is a declining variable as well. That's falling, it's not rising. So, and hanging over all that, if Pat Minford's right, then it doesn't matter what you do for the FDI in the single market, it's negative. It's a game over. So that's the conundrum that they face. And all that against the background of anemic EU GDP change, a demographic winter with loss of 40 million people between now and 2050, roughly. Huge demographic decline there, and what that means for the EU standing in the world, and indeed combined with anemic growth in the lack of reform and Roger's going to tell us how the EU does need to reform to overcome this problem. But it is a problem, without doubt. And of course, hanging over all that as well is any resumption of the euro crisis. And many will know I'm often saying that we're not at the end of the euro crisis, we're merely at the end of the beginning. And I still believe that. And so you add all that up, this is quite an economic challenge. I go back to my comments at the beginning, it may not inform your decision one way or the other, it may be based on other things. And I think the best way to finish in an objective way for a Eurosceptic is to quote the FT and Wolfgang Münchau, not the bastion of Euroscepticism by any means. Wolfgang Münchau wrote, "There may be reasons why the UK may wish to remain a member of the EU, but whatever they aren't economics." I think that probably sums it up. Thank you very much.